John Everett felt the chill of dawn as he stepped from his black SUV onto the cracked gravel drive. He wore a stiff gray suit cut for boardroom meetings, but today he would walk through a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The old mansion rose before him, its windows boarded, its bricks stained with age. Ivy crept over the walls like a living tapestry, and tall grass waved in the breeze as if greeting him. At 60, John had seen many grand homes, but none held the promise of profit quite like this one. He had already signed the papers to buy it, and now he came to plan its end. Behind him, his survey team followed. It carried clipboards, cameras, and measuring tools. John watched them fan out across the property, clicking their cameras at every broken shutter, every sagging column. He noted the piles of fallen stone, the collapsed porch, the split oak doors. To others, it was a ruin. To John, it was an empty canvas. He imagined cranes lifting the rubble, bulldozers carving a neat circle of cleared land, and architects drawing blueprints for his next trophy, home. He paused at the edge of the lawn and looked back at the city skyline on the horizon. Towers of glass and steel caught the early light. In that modern world, ancient mansions could seem out of place, relics of a quieter time. John never wasted a chance to reshape such relics. He had grown up in a modest home himself, the son of a plumber and a schoolteacher. He often thought back to the day his father gave him a toolbox and said, "Build something that outlives you." John had taken that advice to heart. He built wealth and left buildings behind. As he moved forward, the crunch of gravel under expensive shoes reminded him how far he had come. He had started his first factory in a rented warehouse when he was 25. Now he led a company that made turbines for wind farms around the world. People called him ruthless, but he thought of himself as careful. He knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. He did not linger on the past, and every new project was an opportunity. His team gathered around him beneath a sagging portico. The beams above their heads had rotted away in places, and splinters fell like dusty snow whenever someone leaned against them. John smiled briefly, mostly to himself. He tapped the side of his nose. "Let's map out the demolition zones," he told them. He spoke with calm authority. The younger engineers nodded and spread their plans across a folding table someone had brought. They measured distances to the tree line, marked the spot for the main blast, and speculated on how quickly the old foundation would come apart under their machines. While they worked, John walked further down the path that led toward the carriage house. He liked to understand every corner of a property he bought. He imagined how the place would look when it was cleared. Fresh earth mounded high, wild vines gone, a blank turf waiting for concrete foundations. He pictured his architects and builders arriving in shiny trucks, workers in bright vests, chatting as they unloaded steel beams. By autumn, he could have a modern villa with floor-to-ceiling glass, a pool that reflected the sky, and terraces for sunset dinners. All that lay between now and that vision was a few days of controlled demolition. He rounded a bend in the path and stopped again. A small doghouse stood beside the old carriage house, its paint peeling, the wood weathered gray. It seemed out of place. And for a moment, John thought someone had forgotten it there. Why would anyone keep a doghouse in an empty yard? He frowned and walked closer. The entrance was dark inside, and the roof sagged at one corner. The team's chatter faded behind him as he studied it. He tapped on the side. Looked sturdy. He muttered. Survival instincts told him this doghouse should have been removed long ago. But his practical side asked why it was here at all. A sudden breeze whistled through the trees, and the sound carried toward him like a soft sigh. John stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He glanced at the doghouse again, half expecting a fox to dart out or a raccoon to skulk inside. The world seemed eerily still. He turned to call one of his engineers over, but a voice stopped him. It was faint, a whisper that sounded like a person saying hello. Tense muscles tightened in his shoulders as he strained to hear. The whisper came again, low and trembling. The surveyors froze in their tasks. Some looked at each other, uncertain. Others reached for their hard hats. John's confident smile faded. He took a slow step toward the doghouse, his heart skipping a beat. In all his years buying property, he had never found a person hiding where none belonged. He and his team had flooded basements, cleared attics, and searched fields, but never a doghouse, never at sunrise, when an early worker might surprise. A stray animal, not a human. He kept his voice level. "Did someone call for help?" he asked. His words echoed strangely in the empty yard. Only the whispering grass answered. He reached the doghouse and knelt. The wood under his fingers felt rough and damp. He placed his hand on the peaked roof. "Open up," he said softly, though his tone held steel. His engineer, a young woman named Mia, joined him. She shone a flashlight at the entrance. The beams swept across a small, dim space. In the back corner, draped in a ragged blanket, sat a figure hunched over. John's breath caught. He straightened and cast a quick glance. At the team, who stood a few steps away, he raised a finger, and they paused. No one dared move. No one dared speak. The figure shifted, and John saw a flash of pale skin and white hair. The man raised his head, his eyes wide with fear. He looked as if he had aged far beyond his years, as if hardship had carved lines deeper than time itself. A blanket around him was torn, and his clothes were old. John felt a pang of something he did not often allow himself to feel: surprise mixed with concern. The old man's lips trembled. "Please," he whispered, "don't hurt me." His voice was so soft it was barely audible over the wind. The fear in his eyes told John that this stranger believed he faced danger. Only, John carried the power to harm or to help. He slowly slid back his knee and reached for the doghouse roof. "Sir," he said gently, "I'm John Everett. I own this property now. Can you tell me who you are?" The stranger blinked, unsure. His voice cracked as he tried to answer. I thought no one would find me," he said. "I thought I was safe here." His words echoed in John's mind. Safe here. The mansion was not meant to be safe for a person. But this man had lived here hidden. John felt a rush of questions crowd his thoughts. How long had he been here? Who was he hiding from? And how would this discovery change the clean slate John had planned? He rose to his feet, brushing dust from his trousers. His engineers watched him with curious eyes, looked at the doghouse again, its simple shape now holding a secret no one expected. He thought of demolition crews coming in tomorrow, heavy machines tearing down walls without hesitation. For a moment, he felt the weight of responsibility he rarely acknowledged. This place was not just bricks and wood, it had sheltered a life. John raised his hand, signaling his team to hold their positions. The air felt heavy with possibility, as though the old mansion itself waited to reveal more of its story. John took a deep breath. He would need to set aside his demolition plans, at least for now. The morning light had revealed more than broken stone and overgrown vines. It had revealed a hidden life. And John realized that sometimes the greatest opportunity lay not in erasing the past, but in uncovering it. The morning sun rose, pale and cool, as John Everett arrived back at the old mansion with his demolition crew. Large machines rumbled to life in the distance. A bright yellow excavator rolled onto the cracked drive, its steel arms swinging slowly. Workers climbed into cabs and checked gauges. Others unrolled orange safety fencing around the gardens. Dust hung in the still air, and broken glass from the boarded windows caught flecks of light. John stood beside the machines, his gray suit dusted already, and watched as work began again. He still felt the weight of yesterday's discovery, but he reminded himself of his plan: clear this land by week's end. He walked past the fallen columns and toward the carriage house first. The carriage house doors hung open on rusted hinges. Inside, old horse stalls stood empty, their wooden walls scratched and faded. John tapped his fingers on the lintel and peered into each stall. A few pigeons fluttered away, startled by the noise. The crew worked quietly around him, loading debris. Onto flatbed trucks, John took in the sight of splintered wood and cracked stone. He pictured bulldozers moving in to tear down these walls. It was all so familiar, another forgotten building made new through his vision and his resources. After inspecting the carriage house, John moved toward the rear lawn. The grass here grew taller than a man's ankle, swaying in a gentle breeze. He noted the line where wild lawn met dense forest. A path that once led to guest cottages now lay hidden under vines. He called to his project manager, Marcus, and asked for a progress report. Marcus glanced at his clipboard, adjusted his hard hat, and spoke in a low voice. "We're on schedule, sir. The power lines have been capped, and we'll start the main implosion this afternoon. Everything is set?" John nodded and smiled curtly. He trusted Marcus's skill, though his own heart still tightened at the memory of the hidden man. Steps then carried him to the spot where the small doghouse stood. He remembered how it had looked weathered against the side of the carriage house. Peeling paint and rough wood had seemed odd among the larger ruins. Now, with workers swirling around, it felt even more out of place. He paused and rubbed his chin. Marcus was gathering demolition permits in his truck. John decided to check that doghouse again, just to be sure nothing unexpected remained before the big machines arrived. He stopped a step away and listened. The machines sounded like distant thunder against the mansion's broken walls. Hammers tapped and saws buzzed. But near the doghouse, the air seemed still. John leaned forward and narrowed his eyes at the tiny entrance. Inside, the darkness was complete. He called out in a steady voice, "Is someone there?" His words felt strong at first, then uncertain. The world held its breath. Then came a whisper, so soft he almost missed it. It sounded like help. "Me." John's confident expression faltered. He straightened and raised a hand to signal the crew to halt. One by one, the buzzing machines stilled. Saw blades spun down. The rumble of engines faded. Work boots scraped gravel. Sudden silence made John's heart beat louder. He motioned for Marcus to join him. Marcus jogged up, wiping sweat from his brow. John pointed to the doghouse. "I just heard someone inside," he said. Marcus frowned and leaned down, calling into the entrance. "Hello? Are you okay?" No answer came, only the hush of empty wood. John knelt on one knee beside the doghouse and shone a flashlight toward the opening. The beam of light trembled in his hand. He saw dust motes float, then the inside walls of old planks. The space was cramped and ugly. He ran a finger along the frame. It felt rough, coated in moss and rot. John swallowed hard. He looked up at his crew standing behind him in a half circle. Some faces showed confusion, others concern. One young man bit his lip. A woman on the far side of the group shifted her weight. None dared speak. John reached carefully for the sloping roof. It was heavy with age, but he lifted it enough to peer inside. The flashlight revealed a small, huddled shape in the back corner. The man inside rocked gently, as if comforting himself. John's breath caught. He lowered the light and looked back at Marcus. "Call the paramedics," he said quietly, "and get security in place. No one goes near this spot until we know what we're dealing with." Marcus nodded, pulled out his radio, and barked orders. Within moments, 2 crew members moved in to mark off a safety zone. They carried cones and tape. The man in the doghouse stirred and let out a soft moan. John set the roof gently aside and knelt again. He placed the flashlight on the grass, so he could see the man's face. The figure looked older than 70, with pale skin and deep lines carved across his forehead. His eyes were glassy and filled with fear. His voice came in a shaky whisper. "Please don't hurt me." He pulled the blanket tighter around his body. John's chest tightened. He held out a hand, careful to keep his tone calm. "I won't hurt you," he said. "My name is John Everett. You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The elderly man blinked and stared at John's outstretched hand. He didn't take it, but he lifted his head slowly. "I am Thomas Reed," he said, his voice barely above a breath. He paused, then whispered, "I've been here for so long." John felt a lump form in his throat. Here was a man who had made this broken doghouse his world. John knelt beside him and gently lifted one corner of the blanket. Beneath it, old clothing hung loose on a thin frame. The man's hands trembled. His eyes darted to the demolished garden, to the mansion beyond, then back at John. John gestured for Marcus, who knelt on the other side. "Thomas," John said, "we're going to get you out of here. Help is on the way." He glanced at his crew, who stood watching like onlookers at a strange play. "Give him space," John ordered. He moved back and let Marcus and Medics approach. The medics knelt and spoke softly to Thomas, checking his pulse and looking for injuries. One wrapped the man in a clean blanket. The other placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, steadying him. Thomas's eyes flickered with relief and disbelief. As the paramedics prepared to lift Thomas onto a stretcher, John remained close. He felt a strange mix of guilt and determination. He had come here to destroy a building. Instead, he had found a living soul in its shadow. He thought of his own childhood home, of his mother and father struggling but always loving him. He thought of how safe he had always felt. Thomas had known only fear and hiding. John promised himself then that he would not let this man face cold walls again. He watched as Thomas was carried away slowly, each breath a visible effort. John turned to his crew, his voice firm. "No demolition today," he said. "We'll pause until we understand his story." He saw nods of respect pass through their ranks. The machines remained silent. The old mansion stood in quiet protest, its broken windows like watching eyes. John took a deep breath. The project he had planned was on hold. A new story had begun. And John Everett knew that some ruins were meant to shelter truth, not erase it. John spent the afternoon at a small office that Marcus had arranged inside a rented van near the mansion. The walls were lined with maps, blueprints, and old photographs of the estate. In one corner, a laptop glowed with a grid of folders labeled with dates and names. John sat at a folding table, feeling the strange pull of responsibility. He had come to this place to tear it down. Now he needed to build a story of its past. Across from him sat a lawyer named Alina, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She tapped a pen against her notebook. "We pulled county records from the last 70 years, she said. "The mansion was built in 1925 by a family called the Hawthorns. They lived here until the fire in 1947. After that, ownership passed to distant relatives who never lived here." She paused and adjusted her glasses. "No one seems to have visited the property since the 60s. John furrowed his brow. "So how did Mr. Reed end up here?" Said he was part of the family. Alina shook her head. "No record of a Reed in the Hawthorne line. But I found a newspaper article from 1947 about a boy named Thomas Hawthorne. He was thought lost in the fire. The headline called him the only survivor. Then mention of a local caretaker, a man named Jacobs, who might have rescued him. There's also a will from the original owner. It says that if Thomas, the son, ever returned, he was to inherit the estate. But the will was never updated, and the property passed on automatically after the parents died." John leaned forward. "If Thomas Hawthorne survived, he might be the legal heir." Alina nodded slowly. "Exactly. But the court never heard from him, so the line went cold. The distant cousins took over, then sold to developers." She tapped the notebook again. "Your purchase was valid because no one claimed the will." A hush fell over the group. John stared at the maps. The mansion's faded outlines seemed to breathe under his gaze. He thought of Thomas Reed's ashen face, the thin blanket, the fear in his eyes. He thought of the doghouse that had kept him hidden all these years. John realized that the law had treated the estate like a piece of land, but it had sheltered a life someone never knew. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed out. Then he opened them and met Elena's expectant look. "We need to find proof," he said. "If Thomas Reed truly is Thomas Hawthorne, we must help him restore his rights." Alina smiled, relief softening her face. "I'll contact the historian who wrote the 1947 article. He might have sources about the caretaker Jacobs," Marcus added. "And I'll pause the demolition permits. I'll call the county offices tomorrow to delay any action on the land." John nodded. He stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness of sitting too long. He looked out through the van's tiny window at the mansion, silent and waiting. "Let's move quickly," he said. "He spent so many years hidden. He deserves answers." They gathered their notes and files and packed them into folders. The van's sliding door closed with a soft click, sealing their plans inside. The next morning, rain pattered against the mansion's boarded windows as John stepped out of his SUV. He pulled up the collar of his coat and crossed the muddy lawn. The demolition machines had been silenced, inert like sleeping giants. Only, the carriage house stood where it had before, its broken doors still hanging on rusted hinges. John made his way to a small office trailer that had been brought to the site. Inside, stacks of paper covered a folding table. At the head of the table sat Alina, reviewing documents. And next to her was a man with silver hair and a gentle smile. Professor Elliot, a local historian. Professor Elliot stood as John entered. His eyes were bright behind wire-frame glasses. "Mr. Everett," he said warmly, "thank you for inviting me." He wore a tweed jacket and held a leather-bound journal. On the front, the letters J. Jacobs were engraved in gold. John raised an eyebrow. "You have Jacobs's journal?" Elliot nodded. "I acquired it from the local historical society. It was donated by a friend of mine." Jacobs wrote about his time here, taking care of the Hawthorne boy after the fire. He wrote that Thomas was weak, but strong in spirit. He opened the journal to a page dated June 5, 1947. "Here," said, pointing. "He describes carrying the boy through the smoke and hiding him in this doghouse until he could find help." John felt goosebumps. He leaned in to read the neat, slanted handwriting. He read how the fire had started in the east wing, how flames spread so fast that the family barely escaped. The boy, Thomas, had been too young to run on his own. Jacobs had risked his life to save him, then found the old doghouse near the carriage house and tucked the boy inside. He described how he fed him scraps for days until he knew he could bring him, secretly, to the town doctor. Alina reflected on the will again. Jacobs never told the family about the boy's fate. He thought the Hawthorns would want to believe their son was safe with relatives in Europe. He burned letters that pointed to their hiding place. She looked at John gravely. Jacobs wanted to protect the boy, but by keeping silent, he made Thomas a secret for decades. John closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. "So Thomas grew up thinking no one was looking for him," he sighed. "He must have needed to stay hidden, but why?" Professor Elliot closed the journal and said, "I have more." Jacobs noted that Thomas sometimes returned to the mansion as a teenager. He slept in the doghouse, then walked in town for supplies. He didn't want to be found by strangers. He felt guilty, believed he had no right to this home. The old man's voice trembled with emotion. Jacobs felt terrible. He thought he saved the boy, but he trapped him here. He wrote that on the last page. He died soon after, his own heart broken. John looked at the mansion through the trailer's window. The rain had turned the ground to mud, and the ivy on the walls dripped. He felt a fierce anger at Jacobs's secret, but also respect for the man's loyalty. He turned back. "We need to bring Thomas's story to light," he said firmly. "We must find Thomas and show him this evidence," Alina agreed. "Once we prove he is Thomas Hawthorne, we can restore his inheritance." Marcus nodded, closing his laptop with a soft snap. "I'll get the paperwork ready. We'll need his signature and a court order to halt all demolition permanently." John felt a surge of purpose. He had planned to erase this place, but now he had to protect it. He had to protect the man who had lived in its shadow. He closed his eyes and pictured Thomas, thin and frightened, wrapped in a ragged blanket. He pictured him learning the truth and standing tall as the rightful heir. John's heart warmed. At the thought of handing Thomas a key to the mansion, of seeing him walk its halls again as his son returned. Late that afternoon, Thomas Reed returned to the site in an ambulance. He was weak, but determined. Paramedics helped him out and into the office trailer. He wore a fresh hospital gown and sat on a folding chair, his legs shaking. The room fell silent as John entered with Alina and Professor Elliot. They greeted him gently and introduced themselves. Thomas's pale eyes met theirs. He seemed overwhelmed by the rain-soaked papers on the table. Professor Elliot sat beside him and placed the Jacobs journal in Thomas's lap. "Mr. Reed," he said softly, "this belonged to your guardian, Mr. Jacobs." He opened to the page that described finding the boy in the doghouse. Thomas's hands trembled as he read. His breathing came faster. John knelt beside him. "Thomas," he said, "or Mr. Hawthorne if you prefer, you have lived here in secret for many years. Jacobs kept you safe, but he also hid you from your birthright. The law says you are the heir, to this mansion. Thomas looked up, tears in his eyes. Heir, he whispered. This old home? He ran a hand across the journal's cover. Jacobs was my father in every way that mattered, he said. I belonged to him. Alina offered a gentle smile. He loved you, Thomas. But he also thought you should have the choice to know your family and your home. She handed him copies of the will and the newspaper clipping. Thomas's gaze flickered over the legal words, the yellowed headline. He whispered, I can't believe it. He clasped the papers to his chest. John placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder. Take your time, he said. We will help you decide what comes next. For a moment, none of them spoke. The rain beat softly against the trailer walls. Then Thomas looked up and met John's eyes. Thank you, he said in a clear voice. Thank you for what you're doing. John nodded, fighting emotion. You're welcome. You deserve to know your story. Thomas closed his eyes, pressing the papers to his heart. He drew a shaky breath. Then let's tell it, he said. Let's bring the past into the light. Outside, the old mansion waited with its broken windows and silent halls. Inside the trailer, a new chapter had begun. And John Everett realized that sometimes the greatest work came not from hammer and steel, but from finding the truth and letting it shine. John stood by the trailer window as rain slid down the glass. He watched the old mansion rise through mist, its broken windows like watchful eyes. Inside, Alina and Marcus unpacked a stack of boxes filled with papers. They had called in a team of experts, a county investigator, a notary public, and a local archivist. Each had a role in finding the proof they needed. John felt the weight of the moment. He had always moved fast and kept his life neat, but here he had to slow down, pay attention to every detail. He took a deep breath and turned to greet the team as they arrived. The county investigator was a tall man in a dark coat. He carried a leather briefcase and wore glasses that reflected the trailer's fluorescent lights. The archivist, a woman named Clara, held a thick binder labeled Hawthorne Estate Records. The notary, Mr. Patel, carried his seal and a stack of blank legal forms. They all nodded politely to John. Alina introduced them to Thomas, who sat quietly in the corner. His eyes followed every movement. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, but his posture spoke of both fatigue and hope. John felt a surge of protectiveness toward him. Clara opened her binder and spread out yellowed pages on the table. These are land deeds dating back to the mansion's construction in 1925, she said. She pointed to a signature at the bottom of one page. See this name? William Hawthorne. He was the original owner. She flipped a few pages and held up a thin sheet. And here is the will signed in 1930. It states that his only son, Thomas Hawthorne, would inherit everything if he survived the fire of 1947. But the will was never updated after. 1947, John leaned in to read the elegant handwriting. He felt a thrill that surprised him. This was more than a story. It was history waiting to be righted. The county investigator spoke next. I found newspaper clippings in our archives, he said, handing a small bundle to John. John peeled back at the top clipping and saw a grainy black and white photo of charred walls and firefighters. The headline read, Hawthorne Mansion ablaze. Son missing, parents survive. He read the words aloud in a quiet voice. Lena glanced at Thomas, whose face had gone pale. The article described how the mansion's east wing had burst into flame. Late at night, it mentioned that young Thomas had vanished in the chaos. Rescue teams searched for days, but found no trace of him. Neighbors assumed he had escaped, or that he had perished. No one knew the truth. John felt a lump in his throat. He folded the clipping and placed it gently on the table. The notary clicked his pen and said, With these documents, Mr. Rediff, you accept your birth name, you can claim legal ownership. We need your signature on the affidavit of heirship. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked at the will, then at the clipping. His fingers trembled as he reached for the pen. Alina placed her hand over his. Take your time, she whispered. Marcus stood by the door, arms crossed, watching with respect. John stepped back, giving Thomas a space. Thomas closed his eyes and thought of Mr. Jacobs, the kind caretaker who had hidden him in the doghouse. He thought of lonely nights in the woods, of walks into town, of always moving when strangers came near. Oh, he thought of the blank space in his mind where his parents should have been. His heart pounded as he lifted the pen. With a steady hand, he signed the affidavit. The notary stamped it, and the room seemed to sigh with relief. John offered a small smile. He felt the project shifting under his feet. What had begun as a demolition had become a journey to restore a man's life. Clara brought out one last item, a faded photograph album. She passed it to Thomas. On the cover were the initials WH in gold. The pages inside held images of a happy family, a young boy in a sailor suit, his parents holding hands, and the mansion shining in sunlight. Thomas turned the pages slowly, his eyes welling with tears. He traced the face of the boy who looked so much like him. Alina stood behind him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is your past," she said softly. "These are the people you belong to." Thomas pressed the album to his chest and whispered, "I'm home." John watched the scene. With a full heart, he thought of his own childhood memories of a modest house, of his mother's laughter, his father's steady advice. He realized that buildings hold more than walls. They hold memories. He understood now that his role was not to erase this place, but to protect it. He turned to Marcus. "Pause everything," he said firmly. "Cancel the demolition crew. We're preserving the mansion as a historic site." Marcus nodded without hesitation. He reached for his phone and began calling the crew to stand down. Sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting the mansion's facade. The ivy looked bright, the bricks warm. John felt a deep sense of rightness. He stepped outside and walked toward the mansion, his footsteps firm in the wet grass. He placed a hand on the cold stone and thought of Thomas reclaiming this home. He felt a smile spread across his face. At last, the past and the present could come together here, under his watch. Inside the trailer, Thomas stood with Alina Clara and the notary. They completed the last papers. Lena handed Thomas a new set of keys. They jingled softly in his hand. He turned to her, tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled and said, "The thanks belong to Mr. Jacobs. He gave you this chance by loving you." Thomas nodded, his voice thick. I will honor him," he promised. John rejoined them, placed his hand on Thomas's back and said, "Welcome back, Mr. Hawthorne." Thomas looked up, his eyes bright with emotion. He whispered, "Thank you, John." As the team packed away their documents, John and Thomas walked toward the front doors of the mansion. The boards were still in place, but the new keys fit the lock underneath. Thomas hesitated, then pushed one board aside. The doors swung open. With a low creak, inside, dust motes danced in the beam of daylight, filtering through broken windows. The air smelled of age and memory. Thomas took a shaky breath and stepped across the threshold. John followed, closing the doors gently behind them. They stood in the grand hall together. Sunlight played on the faded wallpaper, revealing patterns of roses and vines. A broken chandelier lay on the floor, crystals scattered like tears. Thomas's face glowed with joy, as if the beauty of the place shone just for him. He ran a hand along the banister of the sweeping staircase. "It's more beautiful than I remembered," he said. John smiled. "It's worth saving," he replied. Thomas turned to him. "Only because of you," he said softly. John shook his head. "Because of you," he answered. And in that moment, they both knew that the mansion's story had come full circle. from loss and hiding to truth and homecoming. John Everett stood just inside the mansion's front doors, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers. He looked down the grand hallway, where dusty floorboards stretched toward a distant room. He thought of the work ahead, repairing walls, replacing windows, bringing light back into these rooms. But for now, he simply watched Thomas Hawthorne take his first steps as the rightful owner. Thomas moved slowly, his eyes wide with wonder. He brushed aside a long spider's web hanging from the ceiling. "Almost forgot how quiet it can be," he said softly. John nodded. "This place needs to breathe again." They walked side by side down the hallway. The wallpaper was faded and torn, but the floral pattern still peeked through. Thomas reached out and pressed his palm against a section of wall. He closed his eyes and inhaled the old, sweet scent of history. John watched him, thinking how few people get to touch their own past in such a direct way. He thought of his own childhood home, now gone, and felt a sudden kinship with Thomas's joy. He wanted to help Thomas preserve every memory. First room on the right, they found a broken fireplace. The hearth was black with soot and the mantel had collapsed. Thomas knelt to examine the stones. "My mother used to hang stockings here," he said, his voice catching. He imagined her placing small gifts by the fire on Christmas Eve. John put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll restore this for you," he promised. Thomas looked up and managed a small smile. "It will be like she never left." They moved on to a room with large windows overlooking the overgrown garden. The glass was cracked in many places, but through it they could see a wild tangle of roses, ivy, and weeds. Thomas pressed his face against the pane. "I used to pick flowers here," he said, tracing a pattern on the glass with his finger. "Mrs. Jacobs taught me which ones smelled the best." John knelt and picked a faded rose petal from the windowsill. "We'll bring the garden back," he said. "You'll smell those roses again." They climbed the staircase, the banister wobbling beneath their hands. Each step creaked, but it held firm. At the top, a long landing led to several doors. Thomas pointed to the first door on the left. "That was my bedroom," he said. John placed a hand on the doorknob and opened it. Inside, the room was small and empty, with a single beam of light shining through a hole in the roof. Dust floated in the beam like tiny stars. Thomas stepped inside and looked around. "I drew on that wall," he said, voice low.
"I drew
"Pictures of my dog and of the sky." He ran his finger along the blank wall. "I want to see them again." John smiled and said, "We'll find the old sketches or help you redraw them. You can fill this room with your memories." Thomas nodded, eyes bright with tears. He walked to the center of the room and spun slowly, taking in every corner. John watched his face, full of hope and sadness mixed together. He knew Thomas carried the weight of decades spent in hiding and uncertainty. Now, for the first time, he could reclaim his childhood. They continued down the hallway to the room at the far end. This was the library, John guessed by the empty shelves lining the walls. He remembered the journals and books Professor Elliot had mentioned. He pictured old leather bindings and yellowed pages waiting to be discovered. Thomas pressed a hand to one shelf. "I remember sitting here reading with Mrs. Jacobs," he said. He closed his eyes and nodded, and for a moment the room felt filled with warm light. John placed a hand on his back. "We'll find those books," he said, "and fill these shelves again." As they toured the mansion, John began to see his own role shift. He had come to demolish, but now he wanted to restore. He thought of the crew and the machines waiting outside. He pictured fresh paint, new windows, and careful repairs. He would hire craftsmen to fix the broken fireplace, gardeners to tend the overgrown grounds, and historians to match the original decor. He would preserve every detail that mattered to Thomas's memories. They reached the attic, climbing a narrow staircase.
all light
Filtered through a small window high on the wall. The space was filled with old furniture, dusty trunks, and forgotten toys. Thomas knelt beside an old wooden chest. He opened it and found yellowed photographs and a tattered teddy bear. He picked up the bear gently, its fur matted but still soft. He hugged it to his chest and closed his eyes. "My Jacobs gave me this," he whispered. "It kept me company in the doghouse." John knelt and placed a hand over his. "I'm glad you have it back," he said. They stayed in the attic a long moment, letting memories fill the empty air. Then Thomas stood, clutching the bear. He looked at John. "Thank you for finding this place," he said. His voice was steady now. "Thank you for caring." John felt his own eyes begin to shine. "You deserve it," he replied. "Your home, your past, they matter." Outside, the work crews were already arriving for the restoration. John listened as hammers tapped and saws whirred. He watched landscapers begin to clear the garden path. He saw the first crew bring in scaffolding for window repairs. He felt a surge of energy. This place would come alive again, not as a blank canvas, but as a home full of history. Late that afternoon, John and Thomas stood on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Thomas held the teddy bear in one hand, and his other hand rested on the railing. John stood beside him. They did not need words to share the moment. After a time, Thomas spoke. "I never thought I'd see this place waking up again," he said. John nodded. "It's just the beginning," he answered. "We have work to do, but I promise we'll do it right." Thomas looked at him and smiled, a bright, sincere smile. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John felt a sense of peace. He had come here to erase a building, but he found a life that needed saving. He had helped Thomas reclaim his past and set the mansion on a new path. He realized that true success was not measured by what you destroy, but by what you restore. He looked at Thomas and felt gratitude for the lesson. Together, they watched the last light fade from the sky, ready to bring light back to the old mansion and to the life it held within its walls.